Thank you so much for being here, everyone. Thank you to the Korea Society. Thank you to Yun Ko-eun for being here with me and Estelle, our wonderful translator. I'll start with just asking a question about short stories, which is what we're talking about. Tell us how and when you began writing short stories. What does short story writing mean to you as someone who has written many books now, and what does it mean now for you?
반갑습니다. 정말 뜻깊은 자리에 제가 또 뉴욕에 와서 이렇게 초대되어서 너무나
First of all, I want to say how happy I am to be here in New York with you all here. It's a very meaningful opportunity for me, and it's even more meaningful because we are talking about short stories, because it always has a special place in my heart. For Korean writers, I feel like short story writing is almost like visiting your hometown. That's how I would like to talk about it. Because for me, I debuted with a short story of mine in 2004. And so that means that I've been writing short stories for about 20 years now. In between that, I have been writing novels as well as short stories. But I think the thing about short stories is that you're really able to capture everyday life from very different angles or very different perspectives, and I think there is a certain freedom that comes from that.
오히려 어떨 때는 자유롭다라는 기분을 느끼기도 합니다. 제가 궁금한 것은
To you, Gina, is what attracts you to the short story form. I know that you've released your short story collection and as well as a novel, but yes, what is it about short stories?
I think the thing I love the most about short stories is, they're short. So I love to read something short, but also writing something short. You have such a limited opportunity to create the world and the character that you're creating. And I find that I can be more playful and more experimental in the short story form. So with my short stories, I feel, I think, as you said, more free to experiment with magic, legends and myths, as well as science fiction as well. So it feels like a really exciting form for me.
One thing that I'd like to talk about is that for me, I've been reading foreign short stories, mostly foreign short stories that have been translated from English into Korean. But because there was a lot of stories that I was able to get my hands on, I do remember being influenced a lot by foreign short stories. But the thing that I noticed a lot is that I feel that I did read Gina's short story in the English version. I feel that foreign short stories are a lot shorter in length than Korean short stories. So I thought that was an interesting thing. Yeah.
좀 다르기 때문에 이런 부분들이 좀 더 재미나게 다가오기도 했습니다.
Since we're on this topic about, length, I would love to know for Yun Ko-eun how you describe, or if you can describe how you balance character development and plot, creating this world in such a short and concise format. What limitations do you think you might have when it comes to writing short stories?
네. 저는 이제 한국에서
Going back to length, Korean short stories, I feel like are almost like half as longer than English short stories. But I think because of that, Korean writers are less pressured to keep a short story at a certain length. For example, in Korea, I think the thinking is that as long as a short story is above a certain amount of words, then it qualifies as a short story. And it's not a concern that a short story is too long, if that makes sense. But so for me, but of course, because it is longer than a novel, the things that I think of, for example, if I have inspiration of something to write about, I think my inspirations are sort of like put on a conveyor belt of sorts. Like one is a conveyor belt that's for a novel, and then one is for short stories. And I sort of balance these two out and think about whether this inspiration would be better suited for a short story or a novel. And I think because of that, short story writing almost is not, I wouldn't say it's a limitation for me. I would think that short story writing, it's almost like playing a game.
제약이라기보다는 좀 재미난 게임처럼 느껴지기도 해요. 그래서 한국에서 제가 접했던 단편들에 비하면 이 그린 프로그라고 하는 이 작품집의 그 단편 길이는 비교적 짧은 편인데
Coming back to Green Frog, I realized that the short stories in your collection are shorter than the short stories in Korea, but I felt that it was such a fresh and new take because the short story had such twinkling moments of vibrancy, and I really loved that so much. And in particular, I really love that you brought back the folktale of the Green Frog, which is a folktale that is so that I've learned about when I was so little and so young that I'd completely forgotten about it. And I think your story helped me to re-encounter that story. And also I felt that it was so interesting to see that Green Frog story to be reinterpreted for the 21st century as a young woman, as a protagonist, as a young woman. And so I think my question to you is, how did you think of bringing out these elements of folktales, Korean folktales, into your work, and how did that inspire you?
이야기, 신화 이런 것들에서 이야기를 또 끌어내실 생각을 하셨는지 인터뷰를 보니까 또 영감을 많이 받으신다고도 하셨던 것 같아요. 그 얘기를 좀 듣고 싶기도 합니다.
Yeah, what a great question. Also, I first want to comment on how interesting it is that there isn't this limitation around length in Korean short stories. That feels very freeing to me because I think in America, the publishing market can often be very strict and sort of genre focused. If it's over 10,000 words, it's not a short story. So it's interesting to me to hear that Korean writers have a little bit more kind of freedom in that regard. And then in terms of Green Frog or Jeonggeguri, so this is a story I grew up hearing like a lot of Korean children and children of the Korean diaspora. And I grew up here in America, but my parents who are here, they always raised me to be very proud of my Korean heritage. And one of the way that they did that was just telling me stories like folk tales, fairy tales. And of course, for folks in the audience who might be from the Korean community, you know that parents will call their children Jeonggeguri if they don't listen, right? So, and it's often very playful and funny. But I thought it would be interesting to think about what it would mean to deal with this story if your parent is no longer there. So in the story, it's I wanted to explore grief and also learning how to grow through that experience of losing your parent and finding out who you are along the way.
제가 어릴 때 접했던 그
Back to
청개구리
Green Frog, I think when I listened to the Green Frog story in my youth, I always thought that it was about frogs. But now I realize reading your story that it can be my story as well, and I think that was what was most fresh and new about it.
내 얘기일 수도 있다라는 생각이 들었다는 거, 이것이 굉장히 놀라웠던 것 같습니다.
Oh, thank you. I want to turn to the stories in Table for One. So you've mentioned in past interviews and conversations that daily life is a source of inspiration for you as a writer. And perhaps that's because we tend to lower our guard when we're seeing or doing something that's very familiar. And you've pointed to the act of washing your hair as a reflective moment where your notes and ideas expand into stories. I've also had that moment myself where I'm in the shower and I'm like, I have an idea. Can you tell us a bit more about inspiration and where you find it?
작가들에게 뭔가가
For
그러니까
eureka
유력할 수 있는
moments
순간이
for
온다는
writers
것은
is it's always an
너무나
exciting
좋은 것
moment,
같아요.
right?
그래서
And for
그것을 계속
me, I
기대하게
hold
되는데
certain moments sacred in my life,
제가
and for I think
소설을
I
써오면서
can
굉장히
cite maybe
신성시하게
three of
된
those moments for me.
그런
I think the
순간들이
first
몇
one
개
is,
있어요. 얘기해
as I've
주신
mentioned
것처럼
before,
헤어를
I hold sacred
샴푸할 때
shampooing my
그래서
hair. That's when I get really great ideas.
많이
So much
받기도
so that
하거든요.
I've
많은
received
오랫동안
presents
제출하고
from
이제 샴푸 선물을 많이
readers
받기도
who
하는데 청소할 때
give
그리고
me shampoo
또
to like
하나는
keep on
횡단보도로
receiving
가지고 있을
inspiration.
때 그래서
Um, and the second one is when I'm in
초록불이
front of a
건너가도
crosswalk
된다는
waiting
신호가 올
for
때까지
the
멍하니
light
그
to
신호를
turn
기다리고
green.
있을 때
I
이제
think there's something
뭔가가
about
확
just
스치고
spacing
지나가는
out in
경험을
those
할 때가 있고요.
moments where
최근에
sometimes an
발견한 또
inspiration will
하나의
just like
굉장히
really hit
매력적인
me, or
것은
it'll just like sweep
카페에 갔을
past
때
me. And the
벽
third
옆에
one that
앉는
I've
거예요.
recently discovered is
제
when I sit in a
오른쪽이든
cafe, I'll
왼쪽이 이렇게
sit
벽이
next to a
있으면
wall.
심지어
It can be left or right
유리벽이어도
of me.
되더라고요. 벽이
And it can be
있으면
like
뭔가
a glass
안정감이
wall too,
들면서
I've discovered.
이야기가
But when I
어떤
do that,
얘기가
I feel
흐르는
sort
것을
of
경험하기도 합니다. 그러니까 이런
safe and
사실은
stable. And
꼭
sometimes
완벽하게
the act of
100%
doing that
이야기를
will help
풀어낼 수
me
있는 조건은 아니지만
will help me like
이런 순간이
blast through like
있을
a
거라고
writer's block if
믿고 매
that's
순간
happened
그냥
before.
메모를
But of course, like that,
걸어가면서
it
그런
doesn't
생각이
suffice to just
떠올랐을
wait for
때
those
바로
moments.
이제
I
시작하는
do also
순간이죠. 스마트폰에
quickly jot
메모를
down memos whenever
녹음을
something
해두면
comes to me.
이러지
I think the
않는다면
act of recording is very
아이디어는 잘
important because
떠오르는데
if I don't
그게
record, I can
기록을
see all
하지
these
않으면
ideas
날아가
vanishing around me.
버리거든요.
So recording
기억력의
your
한계가
ideas
더 무서운
very important.
얘기죠. 그런
Which
행동을
brings
그렇게
me
좀
to
기록을
my
하면서
question: is
아이디어를
how do you
붙잡으려고 할
find
때
moments of
지나쳐
inspiration
약간
for your work?
어떠신지도 궁금하기도 하고요.
Yeah, I mentioned before that I do sometimes get ideas in the shower. I think there's something about not being near my phone or my computer or any kind of notebook that where my brain feels freer to think, of an idea. I also, because I live in New York City, there's so many people around. I get a lot of inspiration sometimes just eavesdropping on people. Not that I would ever steal a scenario from someone's life, but sometimes you just hear like all kinds of wild situations happening where, one time I overheard someone having a whole phone conversation about how she had to go clean out her parents' house and, her father had just passed away, but she hadn't spoken to him in years. And I thought that was so interesting. You're surrounded by people at all times as a writer. And I think for me as a writer, it's very important for me to keep my mind as an open container just so I can take note of those moments of inspiration. And I do also take a lot of notes in my phone if I can't get to my desk and start writing. And it's funny, sometimes I look back at those notes and they don't make any sense, but then sometimes I go back and I can piece the fragments together as well. And I think also something about typing on the phone feels freeing too, instead of like being on the computer or writing in a notebook. But I'm also, of course, very inspired by Korean folk tales and stories, just because they were the first stories that I really grew up with, as I mentioned, with my family.
너무나
I
동의하는
agree a lot with what you just said, Gina. That just really sparked a past experience memory for me, and that was when I registered for a dance class, and after 2 classes, I realized I had no talent, and I was gonna stop going, right? But I was changing clothes in the changing room, and I just happened to listen to like 2 college students talk about their day, I guess. But one woman said to the other, she was like, my dad was supposed to get money, but he got soybean paste instead. And so the other friend replied, that's so annoying. And that was it. And I was just so curious as to like what the story was there, that your dad was supposed to receive money, but he received like soybean paste. So from that, I sort of like tried to imagine what the story was there, and I remember developing that into a short story where it sort of starts where someone's dad was supposed to receive like a certain amount of money, but then Instead, he received like 50 kilos of like soybean paste, which is, like as we all know, soybean paste can be very pungent. So just 50 kilos of like pungent soybean paste in the home. That's how the story starts. But I just remember that story.
50kg이 엄청난 강렬한 냄새를 풍기면서 들어오는 장면으로 시작하는 스토리를 쓴 적이 있어요.
That's a lot of soybean paste. That's a lot of doenjang. Wow. I'm curious about what was happening with those girls.
그 뒷얘기를 한번 진아정 작가님이 언젠가 써주셔도 재밌을 것 같아요. 저랑 또 다른
you
방식으로.
have a different take, but you can try and see what happens in your imagination.
We should do a collaboration.
예.
Yeah.
네. 네.
That actually made me think about, well, that's obviously such a funny anecdote. And your authorial voice, of course, in this collection, it shifts depending on the story as it needs to. But throughout, you maintain this sort of very matter-of-fact, but also very funny voice. Can you describe, your authorial voice in general? Do you feel that it's consistent across all of your works? And also, how do you incorporate humor into your stories as well?
네, 제가 처음 소설을 썼던 것이 지금부터 뭐 한 15년 전이다 보니까 사실 써오면서 저도 살아가면서 여러 경험들을 하게 되고 소설 안에 있는
Because I've
그
been writing novels for that started about 15 years ago. As I've accumulated life experiences, I do feel like my characters have also evolved in that sense.
제가 뭐 대장정을 첫 책을 내면서부터 그래 나는 이런 목소리를 낼 거야라고 뭐 15년, 20년 이렇게 쓰겠어라고 그렇게 마음을 먹었던 것은 아니고요. 굉장히
I don't think I've
자연스럽게
ever thought consciously something to the effect of this is my voice when it comes to novel writing. It just so happened that I've been able to spend my 30s and now 40s as a writer, and everything changes, of course. But I think what is important to me in writing novels is what piques my
어떤
interest. And I think
것인가라고 하는 것인데 지금으로서는 뭔가 그러니까 한국 말로는 이제 주객전도라고 하는 그러니까 굉장히 모순된 무언가가 있는 거,
I think
그러니까
for
반어적인
me,
무언가가 있는 거.
as a novelist, things that seem contradictory and have contradictions, that is something that interests me. So I think that I am still in the process almost of clarifying my voice in that sense.
취하고 싶은 목소리를 조금 또렷하게 조금 더 찾아가는 과정 중에 있다고 볼 수 있고요. 쇼스토리는 워낙 많이 다양한
Short stories, because there are more of them, and they seem to be more looser, but also like some characters, there are characters that I want to expand in a more novel format. But I think those could be a little differentiated. And that is also my question to you, Gina.
된 인물들도 있고 그렇지만 그 중에서 또 몇몇은 계속 제가 집중하면서 더 긴 얘기로 끌고 가고 싶은 인물도 있고 그렇습니다. 작가님은 어떠신지도 궁금하고요.
Yeah, I think it's very true that for many writers, our interests and concerns, and of course our work changes as we get older. I've found that with some of the short stories in Green Frog, when I got to the editing process with my publisher, I had to change the ages of some of the characters because I wrote one story maybe 4 years ago, and I made the character 34, and I thought, oh, she's so put together, 34, she's an adult. And now I'm 34, and I know that's not true. But I still wanted that character to have a certain level of a lot of professionalism, success at her job. So I changed her age to 36 because maybe that's aspirational. But I think that, yes, as in terms of newer work that I'm working on now, it's still, I think, almost always about family and parent-child relationships. It's something that I'm very interested in. But it's sort of now become more about, just contending with sort of change in the character is slightly older in my new work that I'm working on than other characters that I've had. And there are a lot of short stories in the collection that are from the point of view of children. And I find writing from a child's point of view also very interesting. I know you've also done this as well, because children are so honest, and that's a very fun place to write from too. And I think increasingly as I get older, I find myself wanting to go back to that place of honesty too, whether it's in my short fiction or in my novels. Um, I would say that my voice is one that's kind of always interested in, well, it depends on the character, I would say. There's a story in the collection that's from the point of view of like a bunch of older ladies at a Korean church. And so that voice is very different from some of the voices of the children in the collection. But I would say that in general, I'm always looking to surprise myself and hopefully to surprise the reader as well. So that's something I think I strive for in my voice.
제가 굉장히 좋아하는 책 중에서 질 클레멘츠라는 작가의 사진 화보집인데 이제 에세이가 같이 들어가 있고 원제는
I want to
제가
bring
잘
up a photo essay called The Writer's Desk by Jill Kremens, which I really enjoyed. It's about, because it's a photo essay, there are photos of writers' desks and about their writing processes. I think, and it shows how different the writing process can be for every writer, right? Like there are some writers who are like, I've done my annual physical exam, I've done my taxes, don't contact me, and you will, like, they sort of fall off the face of the earth. And then there are like writers who like right next to their kitchen sink. And so I think my question to you is, what is your writing process? Like, what does your desk look like? And not only just when you're writing, like what happens when you're resting, or basically like what kind of writing routine may you have?
지금 또 워낙 많은 이야기를 또 수집하고 계시고 또 써내실 거기 때문에 뭐 작업 중일 때 혹은 휴식할 때도 어떤 방식으로 작업을 하시는지.
My writing desk is, so it's also where I work for my day job. So it's very disorganized and chaotic a lot of the time. But I tend to write at night. So I am kind of one of those writers who feels like I have to get everything done that day to settle down to write at the end of the day. And I have a lot of Post-it notes, like motivational Post-it notes posted up by my desk, and they say things like, "You can do it." And they're notes to myself, really. Or sometimes there'll be quotes from people that I find inspirational, and not all of them are writers. Some of them are like artists, fashion designers, anyone who takes nothing and then creates something from it, I think is very inspiring to me. And my writing process, it tends to depend. I don't write every day. I try to write when I can. And if I'm in like the middle of a project, then I'll write maybe more consistently when I can see the finish line in sight. But when I'm not writing, I like to sort of just like, I make a lot of playlists for myself on like Spotify, where I just create like the kind of like mood boards for the work that I'm doing, just so I can go into that world even when I'm not actively writing. And that really helps me stay in the mood, kind of.
그 스포티파이에 있는 음악은
It
여러
sounds like you have a playlist of many songs, because for me, usually when I'm working on one work, I'll just listen to one song on repeat over and over and over, almost to the point where I'm like sorry to the recording artist, because I feel like I'm making him or her like work overtime. But it seems that you have more of a variety.
그 뮤지션에게 미안하다는 마음 들 때도 있어요.
Yeah, I would say it's a lot of different artists and types of genres even. But usually a similar kind of like emotional quality. And now I'm curious about who is the artist that you listened to, either while writing the stories in Table for One or in, your next book that's coming out.
1인용 식탁은 사실 그러니까 테이블 포 원은 저의 첫 번째 소설집이고
My collection Table for One, because that was my first collection of short stories. I honestly don't remember what music I was listening to. It was so long ago.
기억이 나지 않고 가장 최근에 쓴 단편은 아직 이제 책으로 묶이지
The
않았지만
most recent short story that I wrote, I remember listening to a pianist, Yu Bevin, etudes, and suddenly for me, I don't know what it was about it, but when I listened to that song, I would just go into like hardcore concentration mode, like in the zone.
항상 프로그램처럼 갑자기 다른 걸 하다가도 그게 딱 나오면 갑자기 뭔가 그 모드로 훅 들어가게 만드는 그런 음악이었고 가장 최근에 제가 출간한 장편
Then
소설
my most recent novel that's to be published in Korea, Art on Fire, because it was a novel, I sort of had like maybe 3 songs on repeat. I remember there was a Beatles song, Here Comes the Sun, and then a song from Ryuichi Sakamoto. But what the songs have in common is that once I'm finished writing, I will never listen to the songs again. Almost like I went through a breakup with those songs and I'm never seeing them again.
한 작품을 마무리한 후에는 그 음악을 쳐다보지도 않는다는 거죠. 사랑이 끝난 것처럼. 네.
Should we transition to audience questions? Yeah.
Questions, you can raise your hand and we'll bring the mic to you.
안녕하세요. 작가를 지망하는 이윤정이라고
I'm an
합니다.
aspiring writer, but I'm just wondering for both of you, what are your methods to combat writer's block? And then there are some, because, as a writer, sometimes there are moments where you're like, oh, where do I go from here? How do you combat that? And my second question is, how do you deal with the doubt that creeps in? Doubts of, who will read this? Is this worthwhile? Blah, blah, blah.
글을 쓰다가는 좀 이렇게
I guess for me, one thing that really helps is I picture like a person, and it doesn't have to be a real person. It can be someone in your imagination, your perfect reader, someone who, is waiting for this book, is waiting for this story. And that they're just like, they're going to read it and love it. And I think thinking about that person, again, it can be your mom, your best friend, anyone. And just imagining that person is really helpful, I think, because sometimes I think when we write, doubt is, of course, a natural part of the process, but it can very easily become a spiral where we start thinking, about our worst reader instead. So actually the impulse to kind of correct that's helped for me in terms of writing advice is to think about who that best reader might be as well. And sometimes if you're stuck, if it's like a particular plot point or you just don't know what this other character is going to say, sometimes it might be that you just don't want to write it or the story doesn't want you to write it. So you can always skip ahead and come back to it. That's what I've done. Or just rewrite the scene entirely and just see what happens there too. Because I think it's important to pay attention to the places where we get blocked in those ways.
저 같은 경우는 얘기를 많이 하는 것 같아요. 제가 쓰는 과정 중에 만약에 딱
I think for me, both instances when I'm blocked or when the doubts creep up, I think I really sort of like move through that through conversation. For example, if I'm struggling plot-wise with the novel that I'm writing, even if it's not like a potential reader or an actual reader, I would just like call someone up or like I'll meet up with like a family or a friend, a family member or a friend. And for me, when I paraphrase or when I tell them what I'm trying to do with my work or my novel at the time, I'm able to sort of gauge things with their like vocal reactions and their like facial expressions, which also prompts me to try to persuade and convince the listener of this story. And in that process, I'll try to like add on as more like detail or whatever. And in that process, I am sometimes able to receive what I needed in that moment. There will be some like aha moments sometimes that happens for me. So yes, Table for One, for example, I think it's about a person who tries to take a class on learning how to eat alone. So because some of these, concepts may sound so weird and absurd when they're just inside my head, I think I have to like work a lot to persuade who's listening to really like convince them that where this is going and how it's making sense. So that has helped me immensely, that process of like talking it out basically. And I think there's another thing that you can do if it's hard to like talk to someone is you can just try and like paraphrase and write up like a synopsis in your own words, and that could be helpful as well.
이제 그게 뭐 시놉시스 형태로 내가 써볼 수도 있는 거겠죠.
Hi, I was very curious about your experiences publishing in Korea versus in the US, but also in general. I just started working in publishing, and I'm really curious from the writer's point of view what the specific constraints of publishing are in the American market, as you all alluded to, whether that's the length of the short story or even novels, or if there are thematic constraints as well. So just curious about both of y'all's perspectives there.
약간 좀 다른 면이 있는 것 같기는.
I want to say I feel that the fundamentals of storytelling and stories doesn't change, but for me, Disaster Tourist, I think right currently it's either in the process of or it has been published in like 12 to 13 countries. I think the difference that I feel is mostly in feeling the differences in the reading atmosphere of readers in different countries and cultural backgrounds, and the reception may differ a little bit. But because as a writer, I'm not a writer that has been published, that has like a ton of experience in being published internationally, so I don't know if there's anything specific that I want to touch upon in terms of like how it's different in the publishing world per se. But I do feel that I have a deep affection for short story writing, and I do feel that it is very difficult to get short stories published, translated and published in a foreign country. I say that because I know that I'm very lucky to have been able to publish Table for One here. Korean writers, I think, write a lot of short stories. There's a lot more opportunities to write short stories, and because the length of short stories, like I mentioned, is sort of in the middle of a short story and a novel, maybe like a novella, but because of that, I think we're able to I think we're able to put a lot more of ourselves in it. But yeah, I come back to the idea that I think it is very hard to get short stories published in a foreign country, not because they're Korean short stories, but because I think there's also a change in the world where the reading population worldwide has gone down, and I think there is maybe less of an appreciation for the short story format. So yes, I think it's a myriad of factors.
더 문학성이 좀 많이 보일 수 있는 그 장르가 출간이 좀 되기가 어려운 것 같아요.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think that I guess I can speak to my specific experience as a Korean American writer who lives and publishes primarily here in the States. I think one of the biggest challenges of writing and getting published in America as an American writer, or even as a non-American writer, but someone who might live and work here, is that the market is so big. The American publishing market, as you probably know since you work in publishing, it's very, very big. And that can be, of course, a great boon in terms of your book reaching a lot of different readers. But it can also mean that, your quote unquote competition is there's just so many more people writing and publishing. And I feel like for writers that I know and for publishing professionals I know, everyone's always talking about like, oh, there's so many books this season. I say that every season, but I feel like it's really true. It might be especially true now because 2024 is a presidential election year, and I think a lot of books are coming out now before the fall, and media coverage is going to be focused on the election. So I think that is a challenge in terms of just like, if you're lucky enough to have an agent, to get published, to have your book in the world, it can feel challenging just to like make yourself stand out in the market. And that's, if you've gotten to that stage of the publication process. I think the other piece of it is, as Yun Ko-eun was saying, the overall there's much more to compete with just existentially as a writer. There's social media. There's so many amazing TV shows and movies out there. And I've heard one writer, it was on an interview that I listened to a while ago, where she was like, I feel like, when I watch TV, I'm competing with like Succession, So that's just another thing to think about, which is that entertainment in general has just become so sophisticated. But doesn't mean that, of course, that there aren't opportunities, more opportunities within those areas for writers. It's just, I think we're writing in a very different market and milieu than people were in like the 80s or even the 90s.
Thank you again for joining us today, and thanks for this wonderful conversation. Thank you, Gina and Yun Ko.
Thank you.